At Wednesday's Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, Senator Chuck Grassley questioned a key Biden nominee on Second Amendment-related issues and alleged politicization in the courts. The Iowa Republican pressed Anthony Johnstone, nominee to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit, about his past statements. Grassley has frequently warned against playing politics in the judiciary and pressed Johnstone on language he'd used regarding both gun rights and the judiciary. The 89-year-old senator is currently running for re-election and holds a sizable lead over his Democratic challenger.
Congratulations to Professor Johnstone. I'm going to ask you some questions to start out with about the Second Amendment. But before I do that, let me lead in with this. In an interview with a newspaper, you said that Young versus Hawaii was, quote, decided on narrow grounds, end of quote. You also reportedly said that, quote, the Ninth Circuit ruled consistently with previous Supreme Court decisions, end of quote. The Ninth Circuit had already held that there was no constitutional right to concealed carry of firearms. Young said there was no constitutional right to open carry. Judge O'Scanlan explained the Ninth Circuit said in Young that, quote, public carry falls entirely outside the scope of the Second Amendment. Even the state of New York conceded that it wouldn't defend that position in a recent Second Amendment case before the Supreme Court. This seems like a sweeping decision, not a narrow one. So 3 questions along that line. First, I'd like to have you explain why you think Young saying that the right to bear arms isn't a right protected by the Constitution is a quote unquote narrow decision.
Thank you, Ranking Member Grassley. If I recall that interview correctly, I was asked to explain whether it would have impact on the state of Montana, and I think it was in that context I'd said that as I understood the case as it stood, that it would not have an impact on the state of Montana given its laws and the laws that were issued in Young. I'm sorry, I don't recall much about the case beyond that.
Okay. My second question, could you please explain why you thought that this was consistent with the Supreme Court decision in Heller, which obviously held that the Second Amendment, quote, conferred an individual right to keep and bear arms, end of quote?
Well, Ranking Member Grassley, I actually start my constitutional law class. The very first case I teach is Heller because I view it as a textbook case in constitutional argumentation. And of course, as a judge, I would be bound by Heller, McDonald, Brune, and all other cases interpreting the Second Amendment.
I think you've just answered my third question, but let me ask it anyway. Is this the approach that you plan to take when interpreting precedent if you are confirmed?
Senator, as a circuit judge, if I were fortunate to be confirmed, I have no choice but to be bound by precedent, and that is how I would approach the job. I would be bound by circuit precedent, but I would also be bound by Supreme Court precedent. And if there were a conflict, an irreconcilable conflict, or an en banc process on the circuit, that would be the only way precedent could change, if there is intervening Supreme Court precedent. And I would be bound to follow that, and I would faithfully do so.
Okay. And my last series of questions would be regard to the Supreme Court and federal courts and the whole issue of politics of the court, or whether it's politicized. After the Supreme Court case summarily held that Montana's campaign finance law violated the First Amendment under Citizens United, you said that the court, quote, gave Montana the back of its hand. I understand it's probably frustrating to lose. Do you think that particular language that you use is an appropriate way to talk about a court decision?
Senator, if I were to be confirmed as a judge, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on particular decisions. I believe, again, those comments were trying to place in context for the public in an explanation the fact that it was quite rare for the Supreme Court to invalidate a state law without providing the state a hearing. And I think it was in that context, not about the reasoning of the case itself, that I made those remarks.
Do you have a particular, I thought that was going to be my last question. Do you have a particular Supreme Court justice that you think has a judicial philosophy similar to your own?
Well, Senator, Ranking Member Grassley, my judicial philosophy starts with the oath to decide cases impartially and faithfully. Impartially, as I've said, means that I would set aside all personal political beliefs. Faithfully means that I would apply the law as written, as enacted by Congress in the text of the Constitution and according to all controlling precedent. You'd asked about Supreme Court justices. That's one of the great pleasures of teaching and working with the work of our Supreme Court. I am impressed, as I said, I start with Heller. I think Justice Scalia was a wonderful writer, a clear writer. I'm Justice Kagan in my legislation class. I'm impressed by her reference to the way she weaves in Dr. Seuss and Shakespeare into the same footnote. Justice Gorsuch, as a Westerner on the court, Justice O'Connor, I think, is also someone who I've had the pleasure to meet. I have my own judicial philosophy, but I am impressed by the service of those justices and all of our justices, and would be honored to be able to serve in the Article III branch under them.
Mr. Chairman, could I have 30 more seconds?
Certainly.
I don't want you to comment on the leak that happened in the draft of the Supreme Court opinion on Dobbs versus Mississippi, but this is probably an obvious answer to this question. But do you plan to release drafts of your judicial opinions for public comment?
Ranking Member Grassley, that was a serious breach of trust. As a clerk on the Ninth Circuit, we were instructed and understood our duties to our judge, our chambers, our court, and the public. And it is entirely inappropriate to leak draft decisions in such a way.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Professor Johnstone.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. As you noted at the opening, you have scheduled